Will be our invitation song as we invite Jim.
Let me ask you, if you will, to open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39 for our study this evening. While you're turning there, let me just take just a moment to thank all of you for the wonderful way that you have received Paige and I this week. We're so thankful to be here. But we have certainly enjoyed the hospitality that you have extended, whether it be in your home or even taking us out to eat, or in some cases bringing something to us to eat. We're so thankful for that, and we want you to know that from the very bottom of my heart. We appreciate all the kindnesses that you have shown to us. It's been so good to be able to be in the home of David and Wendy. I am sad that David is not feeling well. He last night got feeling sick, and so all day today he stayed at home, and we've done everything we can to stay away from him because we don't get what he's got. But David and Wendy have been very nice to us. It's always good to be with them. It's good to be with Randy and his family and get to know them a little bit better. And of course, it's good to be with your elders here. They mean a lot to us, and we're so thankful that they've extended the invitation for us to come, and we just appreciate it so very much. I hope that in the teaching and the preaching of the gospel this week, something has been said that can be encouraging to you in some way. Something can be just a little bit helpful to you as you seek to live the kind of life that the Lord wants you to live. And I want you to know, if there's ever anything that I can do to help any of you in your journey to Jesus, I'll be glad to do everything I possibly can do. And so I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook account. I have text messaging. This is something I would not have said so many years ago, not too many years ago. And so you can get a hold of me by emailing just about any other way. You can even dial the old-fashioned phone and get a hold of me just anytime you want to, and I'll be glad to help any way that I can. Thank you for being so sweet to us this week. We are so deeply grateful. One of the most fascinating stories in all of the Bible is the story of Joseph that is told to us in the book of Genesis. And before we focus on one particular aspect of Joseph's life, what I want to do is kind of give you a little bit of historical background that I believe that all of us know can call easy to mind. Of course, he's introduced to us for the first time in the book of Genesis chapter 37. And there is where his father has made him that coat of many colors. He is favored above all of his brothers. And his father makes him this wonderful coat. And his favoritism to Joseph is obvious to everyone. And because of that favoritism, his 10 brothers hated him and sold him into Midianite slavery in a caravan, Midianite caravan that was heading down to Egypt. And there he was sold to Potiphar, who was captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard. And he was, though a slave in the house of Potiphar, came to be a very trusted person in Potiphar's house. The Bible tells us that Potiphar didn't think a thing about anything that he had, because he put all of it into Joseph's hands. All that he was concerned about was the food that he put in his own mouth. Later, when Potiphar's wife made sexual advances toward Joseph, you remember the story, how that he refused to commit adultery with her, and he was falsely accused by her, and because of that, he was put in prison. But even in prison, Joseph never lost his faith in God. Even in prison, Joseph became a most trusted prisoner, made in charge of all of the other prisoners as well. Finally, after 13 years after he was kidnapped by his brothers, 13 years after he had been sold into slavery, because of his ability to be able to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, Joseph was released from prison. And not only was he released from prison, but he was given charge of all of Egypt. Only in the throne was Pharaoh greater than he. And he was able to gather grain during those 7 years of plenty to store for the 7 years of famine. Then more than 7 years later, now we're more than 20 years since he had last seen his brothers, Famine forced his brothers down into Egypt to buy grain there in Egypt. And there they came face to face with Joseph. And there they bowed before him, just as Joseph's early childhood dreams had predicted. But instead of taking vengeance upon them, as he easily could have done, Joseph embraced them. And he was so glad to have seen them. And he helped them survive the famine and prosper as long as he lived. Joseph actually attributed their actions and his circumstances to the providence of God. He believed that it was God's providence that put him in that place at that time. Truth can often be stranger than fiction. And I believe that you have that truth certainly here in the life of Joseph. But the Bible story, this Bible story in particular, is more than just fascinating in its details. Fascinating in the events that takes place, and the turn of events that take place. There are a lot of valuable lessons that can be learned from the life of many of the Bible characters that we read about, and particularly in the life of Joseph that we're studying tonight. Now, I want to concentrate on one portion of what we read about with regard to Joseph. I want us to look at Genesis chapter 39, and I want us to go back to that part of the story that takes place in Potiphar's house. And I want us to begin reading verse 7. It came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he's put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" As he spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. Now, as we reflect on this part of Joseph's story, I want you to think for a moment just how differently he has acted or reacted than how so many people would have done today, given them having the same circumstances. I am confident that many of the people that I associate with in the world almost every day would have reacted a lot different than Joseph did. But Joseph was a man who retained his integrity and his faith with God. He retained his faithfulness to God to do the right thing. And I hope by now that you're asking the question, how did Joseph do this? What is there about Joseph that caused him to retain this integrity with God? What is there about Joseph that caused him to be so strong spiritually and to do the right thing? Well, I believe the Bible answers this question, and in so doing gives us some keys, I think, to overcoming our own temptation that we face from day to day. Now, as we consider the secret to Joseph's spiritual strength, as we consider the secret to his integrity with God, the first thing we need to understand is that Joseph was a man who believed in God. Joseph was a man who had a deep faith in God. Look at verse 9. How then can I do this great evil and sin against God? All of us here understand that faith in God shapes our lives. Our faith in God makes a difference in the things that we say, the things that we talk about. Our faith in God makes a difference, not only the things we say, but what we do, how we act in our lives. Our faith makes a difference. Our faith makes a difference in how we think and how we look at situations. One of the great tragedies of our time is that so many have been raised with virtually no knowledge of God or the Bible at all. And knowing that, you don't have to be a genius to understand that when children are taught year after year that they're just animals, it's not going to be long before they're going to act like animals. They may be at the top of the food chain, but they're still just acting out of sensuality. They're acting just out of how they feel or what they feel to be right or what they want. And so that's the reason that you will find people who in our community are murderers, and you read every day about assaults that take place, and people's theft of property, and how that our nation and our country and our communities are filled with drugs. You need to understand, my good friends, and I think you do, that it's not people of faith who are doing these things. It's not people who believe in God who are engaged in these things. Furthermore, when faith in God is destroyed, the basis of practical morality among men is destroyed also, because no one can say what is right or what is wrong. You see, our children are taught from grade school the doctrine of evolution. And evolution begins with the fact that there is no God. If evolution is true and there is no God, then there is no accountability to anyone, and there's no standard of right or wrong, and certainly there's no standard of morality. Your standard of morality would be just as good as the next fellows who may have a complete different standard than you. There would be no way to judge between the two. So we would view adultery differently. We would view fornication differently. We would think even about homosexuality differently. But here's the simple fact. The basis for building a lasting moral and spiritual strength, the basis of withstanding temptation when we are faced with it, is a strong and unaltering faith in God. So my question is this to you parents and even you grandparents, because as I look out over the audience tonight, there's a lot of us that our hair has gotten a lot whiter over the years. I remember when yours used to be a little bit darker, and I think you see the same with regard to me. And so as we think about this, we need to have an impact on our children and on our grandchildren. We need to do our very best to teach them faith in God. So we've got to ask, are you studying the Bible with your kids? With your grandchildren? Are you praying with your children and your grandchildren? Are they associating with other Christians? Or are their friends, their closest friends, friends in the world? Do they see you going about your Father's business? Do they go with you? Do they participate with you in things that are good and right as you go about serving your brothers and sisters in Christ? In short, what are you doing to build the faith of your children? What are you doing to build the faith of your grandchildren? It is not going to come automatically just because you have brought them through these doors a time or two. It's going to require a lot more intention than that. Well, another factor of Joseph's ability to be able to resist temptation was that he understood that God had a code of morality that men were obligated to honor. I want you to go back to that same verse with me. Look at verse 9 again. And look at what Joseph says. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? Now, as you think about the thought that God has given us a moral code to follow, think also about how that a lot of preachers today, a lot of theologians and others are actually undermining that morality. There's what's called situation ethics that people are being taught today. And that basically is the doctrine that the situation determines how you react. They tell us that everything is relative and that there are no moral absolutes. And in their world, stealing or lying or murder, all of these things can be right or wrong depending upon the situation. And everybody decides for himself what the situation requires. Similarly, there's today a doctrine called postmodernism. And basically the postmodernism means that words don't mean anything, or rather that they really mean anything that you want them to mean. And in this philosophy, everything is open to one's own interpretation. Everything is subjective. The individual is going to define things like marriage. Have you heard of people who have tried to redefine marriage in our time? You see, all of this is a part of this postmodern philosophy. And have you ever heard people who want to redefine adultery, what adultery is? Or what polygamy might be, or polyandry as the case may be, or even in some cases, as gross it may seem, pedophilia. They want to redefine what it is and to make it seem all right for people to do what I think is to abuse children. Well, such a doctrine, this doctrine of postmodernism, destroys any thought of any objective standard or truth or behavior by which you can determine what is right or wrong, and by what you can, how you can hold other people accountable. I truly believe that this is what's wrong with our judicial system today. You know, the laws of our nation, people are just simply not following today. Even our judges are not following. And I think some of the time, the reason that you hear people who commit such atrocious crimes of violence towards someone. And they're not held accountable to the strictest letter of the law. The reason that that is happening is because of this postmodern thought. Who's to determine what's right or wrong? In this person's mind, he might have been doing what he thought was right. And so if I'm going to believe that each person is essentially a law unto themselves, how can I hold them accountable for these things? I believe that this is at the root of a lot of the problems that we have in our country. Again, it's that postmodern philosophy that you can just do whatever it is you want to do. And then there are many who minimize or ridicule Bible morality, saying that it's just antiquated taboos and old Jewish prejudices which we have outgrown in this modern world that we live in. Well, what all this leads to is the kind of morality or lack of morality that cracks and crumbles when faced with hard temptation and hard choices. Because they reason that it really doesn't matter what we do in the end after all. My point is this. One secret to moral strength is the realization that there is a God. And that God has a code of morality to which He's going to hold all of us accountable. Joseph knew that. And that's what enabled him to resist temptation. And here's what you need to know about that. The more that you deepen your conviction about the reality and the rightness of God's laws, the better you will be able to resist whatever temptation you may face. You know the people you listen to? I want you to think particularly about the fact that Joseph was only 17 years old when this story began. And yet, he's got this deep faith and this deep conviction about what is right or wrong in the eyes of God. We need young people with that same kind of conviction. Amen. Now, there's another secret to Joseph's strength against temptation. And that lies in the fact that Joseph understood the true nature of sin. We'll go back to verse 9 again. How then can I do this great evil and sin against God? Joseph realized, he understood that sin was against God. I understand that you know that there are a lot of people today who really minimize sin. And they would have minimized what it is that Joseph was tempted to do. Sometimes people will minimize their sin by saying, well, it was just a mistake. Well, you know, when I fail to carry out the garbage at home, that's a mistake. But that's not the same kind of thing that we're talking about here with Joseph now, is it? Sometimes there are people who will take the sin that Joseph was tempted to commit, and they'll laugh about it. They'll joke about it. Sometimes people will say when they are involved in some moral sin, well, that's just the way that God made us. Bruce Jenner. And I steadfastly refuse to call him Kate. Bruce Jenner claims that he was born in, he was a woman born in a man's body. We know that's not true. He said, I was just born this way. But now listen, before you judge him too harshly, I want you to consider that we often excuse things like gossip by saying, well, that's just Matilda. She's always had loose lips. She was just born that way. We would excuse somebody like that. No, the problem is she wasn't born that way. The problem is that nobody loved her enough to be able to confront her with her sin and say, Matilda, what you're doing is sin. It is wrong. And here's the point. Instead of treating sin seriously, it seems that the preferred philosophy today is just everything's okay. I'm okay, you're okay. The only thing that's really wrong in our society is being judgmental about others, or even judgmental about ourselves. But please don't misunderstand me, my friends. If you want to find somebody that gets judgmental real quick, you tell them, you make the judgment that they're in sin and they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and just see how judgmental they can become very quickly. They can judge you for making judgments against them really, really quickly. That seems just a little bit hypocritical to me. But Joseph knew that to do what he'd been tempted to do was a matter of breaking God's moral code. He understood the true nature of faith. He understood the true nature of sin. No one can really develop moral strength against temptation by whitewashing sin and by telling other people it's not really that bad. Serious serious or rationalize sin by saying it's no one's business what I do. When it comes down to it, Joseph understood clearly something that we all need to understand too, and that sin is a violation of the holiness of God Himself, and that all sin is against God, and that is a serious matter. What we need to understand, good people, is that God's commands are rooted in His character. God's commands are rooted in His character. And when He tells us thou shalt, or when He says thou shalt not, understand that He's not trying to restrict your pleasure. What He's trying to do is develop within you the character that He has. He's trying to tell you to be holy even as I am holy. He wants you to be like Him. And so when He gives you these commands of things that you need to do and things that you may not do, then what He's trying to get you to see is He's wanting you to follow in His stead. And Joseph reminds us that one of the real secrets to successfully resisting temptation is remembering how evil the sin that we're tempted to commit really is and what it does to our relationship with God. In Psalm 51, this was a psalm that was written pretty much immediately after Nathan had come in and confronted David with the sin that he'd committed with Bathsheba. And in Psalm 51 and verse 4, David said, "Against you, you only, I have sinned," as he prayed, "and done what is evil in your sight, so that you're justified when you speak and blameless when you judge." He said, "Lord, against you and you only I have sinned." Now, you probably know that on the surface, without a little bit of thought, that that's not strictly true. Because David had sinned against himself. He had sinned against his own body. You turn to a passage like 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and you'll see that fornication and adultery is a sin against your own body. And he not only sinned against his own body, but he had sinned, obviously, against Bathsheba because of what he did. He sinned against Uriah on more than one level, in that he coveted his wife, and he took her, and he committed adultery with her, so he sinned against Uriah on that level. He went on to sin against Uriah again in committing murder. He actually had Uriah killed. But have you ever thought that he sinned against Joab too? Because he had to involve Joab in his collusion to have Uriah killed. But not only that, I will tell you, he sinned against some of the other soldiers of Israel, because they died too at the foot of the walls at Ramoth Gilead. They died as well. And so he sinned against them and against their families. In fact, he sinned against the whole nation of Israel. He did. But in the end, he knew something that we all know. And that all sin is first and foremost, all sin is primarily against God. And that's what should matter to all of us. We need to understand the true nature of sin. The true nature of sin is that it is against the very holiness of God Himself. Another secret to Joseph's integrity against temptation was that he was conscious of his obligation to other people. Look at verse 8 and 9 of our text. He refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife." Joseph, it was not lost upon Joseph that Potiphar had put a great deal of trust in him. Now, Joseph was wrongly enslaved. There's no doubt about that. We all understand that. But Potiphar trusted him. And Joseph knew that he had an obligation to keep the trust. That's the whole basis of this statement here. Joseph knew he had an obligation to keep the trust that Potiphar had put within him. Because he had withheld from him very, very little in life. He had given everything into his charge. He trusted Joseph. Now, if you want to make this relevant to yourself, and it's very easy to do that, just think about the obligations you have to the people that are around you. You've got God-given obligations to your husband or your wife. You know, there was a day in which you stood likely before a preacher or a justice of the peace. And you promised that you were going to keep yourself unto them and to them alone, your mate alone, as long as you both shall live. That was a promise. Heard a man one time who had been married for about 70 years. Asked what the secret to such longevity in marriage really was. He says, well, it's pretty simple. He said 70 years ago, we made a promise and we've kept it. And I think that's pretty much what we all need to understand and what we all need to see. We make promises, we need to keep those promises. We have obligations, we need to meet those obligations. We need to understand that as fathers and mothers, we have God-given obligations to our children. Our children have the right, I believe, to a faithful parentage. They have the right to parents who love the Lord with every fiber of their being. They have a right to parents who they believe are going to do the right thing in about every situation. They have a right to parents who are going to leave with them a godly example. Many years ago, there was a little poem that used to be on people's walls, and there would be women who would embroider it and put it on their wall somewhere. And it said something like, a careful man I want to be, a little fellow follows me. I do not dare to go astray, for fear he'll go the self-same way. And so, I always wanted to make sure that I was the kind of man that my wife would be proud to belong to. I have always, and I know she felt the same way about me, I've always wanted to be the kind of father that my children could look up to, and that they could see that though they may disagree sometimes with some of the decisions that I made them on a basis that I believe was a godly basis, that I was trying to do every step of the way, that I was trying to do the right thing. I think children deserve that out of their parents. They need to see that out of their parents. But I'm here to tell you, those of you who are children too, that you've got an obligation in this matter. Because your children are trying to lead you in the way that is right. I know that they're trying to do that, or else they wouldn't be here tonight and wouldn't have you here tonight. So they're trying to lead you in ways that are right, and you've got an obligation too. You've got an obligation to make the right choices. You've got an obligation to honor them by obeying them, because this is the right thing to do, God says. He wants you to do what is good, and not disgrace your parents by doing things that would be evil and that would be wrong. As Christians, we have the obligation to one another to make sure that we uphold our example to one another, that we are a good example to one another, that we can be encouraging to one another, that we can admonish one another from time to time when we need it. We have obligations as Christians to the world to be a light in a very dark place. We influence everyone around us either for good or bad. I think we talked a little bit about that last night, did we not? Now I freely confess to you that there have been times when I have been tempted to sin, and I have been kept from sin merely out of the knowledge of what that sin might do to other people. I did not want my sin to hurt those who are around me, those who love me most and those whom I love most. I can see them in the morning when I wake up. They come to my house quite often and gather around my table. They're called children and grandchildren. And there have been times when, without thinking about them, I might have fallen to temptation. But because I feel them, every one of them, so precious around me, I am committed to do the right thing. Now that doesn't mean that I'm always going to do it, understand? But it means that I am committed to doing the right thing because I love them more than life itself. And that ought to be the attitude of every single person in this building. When Joseph was tempted, Joseph didn't forget his obligation to and his responsibility for other people. And this is one key to his strength in resisting temptation. There's another key that I see in this story. And that is that Joseph understood that circumstances never rationalize sin. Circumstances can never make sin right. Sin is still sin. Imagine how folks today would have excused themselves had they been in Joseph's place. And through the years, I've thought about this situation and this particular point about this situation, and I've written down a list of about 14 different excuses that people could have made. Rational things that people give all the time, or maybe not rational things, but ways of rationalizing their behavior. Joseph could have said something like life's been unfair to me, and then just not cared and gone ahead and given into sin. Well, had life been unfair to Joseph? You've got to say it was. I mean, it's sad that Joseph was in the place that he was in. Life was unfair to him. But he didn't use that as an excuse to give in to Potiphar's wife. He could have said something like, I don't understand why God let this happen to me. As though he were blaming God for what had happened to him. I've known a lot of people who blame God for the situation that they're in. Now, when you look at this and you consider the providence of God, God has brought Joseph down into Egypt. But was God responsible for the evil that happened to him? No, that was the choice. That was the choice of his brothers. That was the choice of Potiphar to enslave him. That was the choice of Pharaoh to enslave him. Those were choices made by evil men that God used to bring about ultimately His good for His cause. But there were choices made by evil men. God didn't do this to him. He could have said, well, this woman is a consenting adult. Well, sure she was. She had free moral agency. She was the one who actually was making the advance. Joseph could have said something like, well, no one will ever know. You know, it's kind of interesting that there's a lot of people who have used that excuse when they've committed adultery over the years. And I'm telling you, that's about the biggest lie Satan will ever tell. Because you think you're going to get by with it? Wrong. You think that only you and the person you're committing adultery with will know about it? No. Because somebody's going to spill the beans. Somebody is going to say something. And you know, even if no one ever knew a thing about it other than you and your adulterous partner, guess what? The one that really mattered would know. God would know. He could have said, no one will ever get hurt. He could have said, I may never have the opportunity for intimacy again. He could have said, well, it's a way to get even with someone who has enslaved me. That's kind of unique, isn't it? Potiphar's enslaved him, now I'm going to get even with him. He didn't do it. He could have said, perhaps she could make my life as a slave easier. Do you reckon that would have been true? Maybe. Maybe not. It's a natural desire. It's not like homosexuality. It's natural. He could have said, this temptation is continuing. You know, she did this day in and day out. You know that, don't you? She did it all the time. I can't be expected to keep saying no. He could have said, others, even my brother, has done worse things. And it would have been true. He could have said, well, she took the initiative. Or something like, I may not look like a real man if I don't give in. Or I'm young. I can't be expected to continue to resist this temptation. Well, here's my point. Though many people use these excuses and, you know, dozens of more to rationalize committing sin, Joseph realized that sin is still sin. Joseph realized that regardless of the circumstances or excuses he might make for it, you cannot rationalize committing sin. Here's what you have to do when you commit sin. You have to say, I've sinned. This is what I've done. Forgive me. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Joseph decided that he wanted to resist temptation. And I believe that this may very well have been the strongest point that we're going to make. It may well be the strongest point we're going to make tonight. I believe that Joseph resisted sin precisely because he wanted to resist sin. Verse 10 says, and she spoke to Joseph day after day. He did not listen to her. He did not listen to her. Now let's face it, we usually do what we want to do. We are presented with a choice. We usually do what we want to do. Joseph did not want to give in to this woman. Joseph made the choice to refuse her because refuse was exactly what he wanted to do. Now I think other folks sometimes are different. I think other folks say something like, I don't want to give in, when giving in is exactly what they want to do. And what happens is they struggle just enough against temptation, long enough to ease their conscience when they actually decide to give in to the sin. This is why some hover around known temptation like a moth around a flame. They stay close enough just until finally they are caught. You may know someone who's a bad influence on you, but you knowingly stay near them and you knowingly stay near the temptation. Partly sometimes because you know you can always blame other people for your failures when you give in. You may know that something is wrong, some activity is a bad influence on you, but you don't stay away. You may say, well, I'm going to go to that lake party, but I'm not going to lust. Really? Really? You may say something like, well, I'm going to go to the prom, but I'm not going to dance. Really? Does it make any difference at all? Married people sometimes form inappropriately close bonds with someone of a different gender, thinking, well, there's nothing really wrong with having friends of another gender. But then, again, you're hovering like that moth around the flame, and you know that one of these days it's going back. Imagine how different Joseph's story might have been had he said, I can't do this, but then constantly spent time around Potiphar's wife. Now, I'm safely assuming here, according to this text, that he did everything he could to avoid her. I think that's why you read in this text that he comes up and he finds himself in a situation where the men of the house are not present. I think that was purely an accident. I don't think he would have gone there if he had known that those men were gone. I don't think he'd have done that because I know he knew what kind of woman she was, and he didn't want to be around her. Years ago, before I started preaching, I worked for Sears and Roebuck, and I drove a service truck, and I did a lot of their service work for different things. And I'll never forget when I was given a call one time, and my supervisor who gave me the call said, now Jim, you need to know that you cannot go to this house. You dare not go to this house unless another service tech is with you. Well, I got ready to go, and I called this fellow to go with me, and he went with me, and I wasn't in that house 10 minutes until I realized why my supervisor said what he said. Because there are people like Potiphar's wife out there in this world. They're there. And you've got to beware of them. And Joseph did. Joseph avoided this temptress because he really wanted to overcome temptation instead of being overcome by it. And that's one secret to how you're able to resist temptation. You've just got to want to resist temptation. So, with that in mind, let's review just briefly. Joseph successfully resisted temptation because he had a deep faith in God. Because he knew that God had a moral code that he expected all the honor, and he understood the true nature of sin. He was conscious of his obligations to others. He knew that circumstances would never make sin right, and he overcame because he wanted to overcome. Now, what makes this personal to all of us is how Joseph faced temptation. How he resisted is exactly how we resist temptation today. His story is a great story as we think about the temptations that we face on a daily basis and how we might be able to resist them. He's a wonderful example for us. We can and should learn a lot from him. He assures us that we too can resist whatever Satan throws at us. But finally, I want you to remember this, because I think this is important too. Even though there's never an excuse for sin, the good news of the gospel is that sin is still, God is still willing, and He's still wanting to forgive you of whatever sin that you may have committed in the past, if we seek His forgiveness on His terms. You remember what was told Simon the sorcerer, a Christian, when he fell? Therefore, repent of this wickedness of yours and pray the Lord that if possible the intention of your heart may be forgiven you. Acts chapter 8, verse 22. So whatever it is in life that you've given into, whatever sin it is that you've committed, you need to understand that the blood of Jesus Christ has the power to cleanse you of your sin, has the power to bring forgiveness to you. If you're here and you're a child of God, it doesn't make any difference what's been in your past as long as you're willing to give that up and seek God on His terms. Repent and be baptized every one of you in the name of Jesus Christ for forgiveness of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. If you'll just simply do what the Lord said to do, then He will forgive you your sin, and you can be received unto Him and into the fellowship of good and right thinking brethren. If there's any way we can help you in your obedience to the gospel tonight, why don't you come in front? All together we stand and all the same.
All things are ready to come.